It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Rapp, who will discuss the misinformation, the reasons we fall victim to fake news. And in talking with Dr. Rapp, he's a professor in both the School of Education and Social Policy and the Department of Psychology at Northwestern University, and is a Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence. His research examines language and memory, focusing on the cognitive mechanisms responsible for successful learning and knowledge failures. It sounds so interesting. He investigates the ways in which prior knowledge, text, and visual materials and learning goals influence the processes and products of our discourse experiences. This has included examining the effects of reading false information, identifying how what people know is not always used most effectively during comprehension, the evaluation of technologies intended to support formal and informal learning, the design of effective presentation systems, and the iterative development of tools intended to support literacy. I know also that he grew up in New York and challenges you to see if you can identify that accent in his speech, and that he's a board game collector, something he has in common with my sister. So we welcome Dr. David Rapp. And David, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Peg. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see everybody, virtually. My wife and I were talking about how we don't get to congregate and gather with people. So this is just a delight to get a chance to talk and see everybody in a group. The only group I really get to see now are my students at Northwestern when we meet for our classes. But this is really great. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you because I prepared a little presentation on the topic today. I hope you find it informative and interesting. I wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of research that we've been doing in my lab at Northwestern that really tries to understand the consequences of being presented with false information, which, as Peg really nicely described, includes but is not limited to fake news, right? We're confronted with misinformation and disinformation and fake news and real news and gossip and all kinds of information every day. So in our lab, we really try to determine what happens when people are presented with inaccurate information, what are the consequences, and are there ways to protect people from falling victim to nonsense, to information that doesn't have any credibility or value. And a lot of this started in my lab. We began working on this in 2006, so way earlier than the current concerns about fake news were presented, but certainly fake news was on people's minds. People were aware there were newspaper articles that didn't have clear evidence. Sometimes journalists were making up information. Gossip is always a problem. So we began thinking about this, and one particular event that some of you may be familiar with nicely exemplifies, really illustrates the problem. And this was a news article that people found online on the internet November 5th, 2016. So immediately preceding the last presidential election. And this was an article that appeared in a news source called the Denver Guardian. And I'm going to read you the headline, but of course you can read it as well. Hopefully everyone can see this. It says, FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in an apparent murder-suicide. And this news article, again, was shared on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on lots of social media sources. It appeared on the TV news. People talked about it in their families. It turns out that this was a fake bit of information. This never actually happened. And it appeared just before the election. So there were real concerns that this kind of news appearing before the election could influence people's voting behaviors. But what I think is really interesting about this is not just that the news was incorrect, that it's a completely made up story, but it turns out that the Denver Guardian is not a real newspaper. So the Denver Guardian is actually a website that someone made where they would put up occasional news that had been made up and fabricated. So this was a motivated attempt to contaminate the news system, to create misunderstandings about what's going on, to affect impact in the world. The Denver Guardian is not a real newspaper source. In fact, people who go to the Denver Guardian website in 2016 would find there was really only one news article that had ever been posted, and again was this one. But people were still influenced by this. If you ask people, was there an FBI agent who commit suicide right before the election? Some people will still say yes. And if you ask people, have you ever heard of the Denver Guardian? Some people will say yes. So despite this being untrue and debunked, it still has had an impact on people's thinking. And that for our lab is a real interesting thing to study. And of course, is a real concern for the world. So the big issue for us in the lab is that people are influenced by what they read and what they hear and what they see. And of course, in most circumstances, this is really good. If someone tells you something that's true, that's been validated, that has been appropriately sourced, where they've done all of the legwork as journalists to understand the information, if as a scientist, they've done a carefully designed set of experiments and are providing you with information, you want to be influenced by those true ideas. The challenge becomes when we're influenced by ideas that are wrong, that represent, again, as Peg mentioned, misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. And in our lab, what we consistently see, like if I had to say, okay, all the work we've done over all the years in our labs, what kinds of things have we seen? If I could break it down into one sentence, it really would be this one, which is people learn and rely upon presented information, both when it's accurate and when it's inaccurate. So you can see when it's accurate, you couldn't ask for better. You really want people to learn the true ideas. The problem becomes when it's inaccurate. And in our lab, we want to know, what can we do to prevent an influence of those inaccuracies? What can we do to prevent people from endorsing, repeating, or being influenced by the inaccurate ideas they might hear? And again, those inaccurate ideas could be fake news, they could be misinformation, they could be disinformation. Now, in today's presentation, I actually want to spend some time, I want to spend some time talking about non-political inaccuracies, not because I want to avoid the issue. It's a crucially important issue. And in fact, the election is coming up in very soon. Many of you are filling out your ballots, as I heard people talking about when I first entered the chat room. We mailed our ballots, and I actually received an email 2 days after mailing the ballots that they'd been received already. So that gave me confidence that my vote will be counted. People are also using ballot boxes. I don't want to talk about political inaccuracies today, because I want to give you a sense that the problem of misinformation is broader than just political ideas. That the problem of misinformation really occurs anytime people are presented with stuff that is wrong. So clearly, political information, it's a big concern right now, but there's a lot of debate. News organizations are trying to figure out how to deal with it. Politicians are trying to understand it and figure out how to talk about it. Some of them taking advantage of it, some of them arguing against it on both sides of the political aisle. But I really want to give you a sense of the general problem of being presented with misinformation. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to show you some of the ways we study it in my lab. And then I'm going to show you some evidence for the problem of being exposed to inaccurate information. And from there, as towards the end of the talk, I'll bring it back to talk about political issues. Because what you're going to see in the evidence I'll show you today is that people rely on and share inaccurate information that's not political. So the problem's only going to get worse if we're talking about political information that people really want to believe is true or really want to believe is false. So I'll show you what I mean. So the way we study this in our lab is we figure out ideas that we know the general population in the United States should believe is true or false. For example, I could say to you, a striped horse is called a zebra. And you can decide whether that's true or not. Most of the people in the United States might endorse that as true. It's not really a controversial idea. A striped horse-like looking animal could be called a zebra. Or here's another idea that people would believe is true. Brushing your teeth is good for you. It prevents gum disease. So that's not something that we would argue about. I mean, we could probably come up with a case where if you brushed your teeth for 4 hours a day, that probably is not good for you. But it certainly is the case brushing your teeth is good for you. So we can find ideas that we know people believe to be true, and we can find ideas that people believe to be false. And then we can use that information to present to people and see what happens when we contradict what they should know to be true. So let me give you an example. In the experiment I'm going to describe today, we had participants read stories in which characters in the story would occasionally say things that were true or false. So here's an example of one of the stories that's describing two people who are traveling around the world and discussing some of their favorite places that they've been. So I'm going to read this to you, and please feel free to read along with me. Let's see, what else did we do? We seemed to spend a lot of time visiting Shirley's relatives. That's why we had to go to Russia, because her family lives in the capital city, St. Petersburg. I had made such a fuss about missing the mosques in Morocco that she let me see the Kremlin while we were in Russia. Now, some of you might notice that there's an inaccuracy in this text, and we specifically put it in there. And that inaccuracy is the idea that the capital city of Russia is St. Petersburg. Most people in the United States know that the capital city is, can you guess which one it is? It's Moscow, right? So the capital city of Russia is Moscow. So the question is, when people read stories where characters misname the capital, does that influence people's later beliefs about what the capital of Russia is? Does it change what people are willing to say the capital of Russia is? So in our experiments, we present people with lots of facts. They read lots of stories containing true facts, false ideas, and something in between. So if you're in our experiment, you might read a story containing this paragraph, but it could tell you the correct answer, Moscow. It might tell you misinformation, a misleading idea like St. Petersburg, or maybe we just leave it blank. We don't give you an answer. So we say, that's why we had to go to Russia, because our family lives in the capital city, and we don't tell you anything. After people read stories containing mixtures of true and false ideas, we give them a trivia quiz. And some of the questions in the trivia quiz relate back to ideas that presented in the story. Maybe this relates to my board game fandom, that I wanted to do this as a sort of Trivial Pursuit kind of task. So what happens is people are going to be asked, what is the capital of Russia? And they have to write down an answer. And the question is, how often do they write down St. Petersburg after reading it, which they shouldn't? Okay, so just so everyone is clear here, people are going to be reading information that's either true, false, or we don't give you an answer. We call that the neutral case, no answer. And then we're going to see how often people use it. So I'm going to show you the data here. This looks complicated. I promise you it's not. I'm going to walk you through it. So what I'm going to show you here are the data for the number of times people say the wrong answer. And specifically, they say the wrong answer that we told them in the story. So this will show you how often do people say St. Petersburg to the question, what is the capital of Russia? And we have lots of questions. Here's another example of a question. What's the name of the medical malady where you have an inability to fall asleep? And the correct answer would be insomnia. But we could also give you a version where we say it's narcolepsy, which is wrong, right? Narcolepsy is an inability to stay awake. But people might read that in the story. So the question is, how often will people say the wrong thing? So on this vertical line, we call this the y-axis. On the vertical line, we're going to see the percentage of time people give you the wrong answer. On the horizontal line, I just want you to pay attention to neutral frame and misleading frame. Misleading is if we tell you the wrong thing. Neutral is if we don't tell you anything, right? So we don't tell you what the capital of Russia is. And here we tell you the capital, but we tell you the wrong thing. And here are the data. What these green bars are showing you is how often people put down the wrong answer. So when we don't tell you anything about the capital, people put down a wrong answer less than 10% of the time. They very rarely put down St. Petersburg. But if we tell you St. Petersburg is the answer, that jumps all the way up to roughly 30% of the time. So 30% of the time, people are using the inaccuracies that they read earlier to answer a question. And to be very clear, we know already people should know what the answer of the capital of Russia is. So they're making mistakes even though they should already know what the right answer is. I have easy items and hard items labeled here just to explain what that is. Some of the ideas presented in this story, we know people should know the answer to, like what the capital of Russia is. But we have some ideas presented in this story that people might not know. For example, who invented the steamboat? That's a harder question to answer. Now, some of you know that it was Robert Fulton, right? Some of you might know that, but far fewer people know that answer than know what the capital of Russia is. And in fact, we can give you the wrong answer and say the person who invented the steamboat is Eli Whitney, who was around the same time, but invented the cotton gin. And what you see is people are more likely to write down inaccurate responses
when they don't know the answer beforehand, that makes sense. I don't know who invented the steamboat, so of course I'm going to use whatever you tell me. But notice people also still make the mistake when beforehand they should know the answer. That's the difference between easy and hard items. And we've replicated this multiple times. I'm showing another set of bars here just to show you we've done this experiment at this point probably well over 50 times, and we get the same kind of effects. So overall, people are reusing inaccurate information that they heard. So now you should be asking, why is this happening? Why are people using information they should know is wrong? Or why aren't they being more careful? And there are two things you really want to think about that you might not have heard before that are really interesting. It turns out, by the way, advertisers know about these two techniques and they use them to great advantage. And it turns out politicians are starting to use this to great advantage, and lots of people are. And in fact, fake news organizations and people who are trying to present fake news are using these as well. So the first is called mere exposure. Mere exposure is the idea, if I simply show you some information, you may use it later because it's available. So if I say to you, the capital of Russia is St. Petersburg, now it's available to you. And simply being exposed to that information makes it more available than information you have to think about. What is the capital of Russia? Let me think about this. So simply being exposed to information often predisposes people to use it. Even more problematically is a set of challenges called fluency effects, which means if I learn something and I can easily remember it from memory, if it's fluent, that means I can easily remember it from memory, I'm more likely to believe it's true than if I have a hard time remembering it from memory. So think about that. Things that I can easily recall, memories I have for parties, birthday gifts, TV commercials, things people have said, if I can easily remember that, I think that's more true than things that it's harder for me to remember, that I have to work harder to recall. So what happens is being exposed to information makes that information available and also is easier to recall later, so you end up using it. I mean, there's a reason why I can easily remember 588 2300. Everyone knows the next word is empire, right? It's easy to remember from memory. It's easy to retrieve. It's a commercial I've seen over and over again. So now it's in memory and available. And because I can retrieve it, I'm more likely to use it. So the problem is reading something that's wrong and having it get into memory makes it available later. And if it gets repeated over and over again, for example, there are some politicians right now who are arguing that absentee ballots or mail-in ballots are going to be stolen. And they keep repeating that idea. And repeating that idea makes it easy to remember and might make you believe it's true if you're not careful. Now, in some experiments, we've also tried to see, because it's an important question, are there differences in how often people use inaccurate information as a function of their political allegiance? So we did this study back in 2016. It's the same study. People are reading stories that contain potentially misleading or true or neutral information. And the question is, how often do people use inaccurate information as a function of whether they told us, this is before the last election, they were going to vote for Trump or they were going to vote for Clinton. This baseline group, we didn't ask them. We didn't ask these people. This is our control group using science terminology. And even though these bars look slightly different, they're really not different. Look how small this difference is. There's no difference between people's use of inaccurate information if they supported Trump or supported Clinton. There's no difference there. Now, again, I want to be very clear. We're looking at information that's not politically loaded, right? Knowing what the capital of Russia is, knowing what the term for falling asleep or being unable to sleep is, knowing whether you should brush your teeth or not. Those aren't politically motivated questions. So when we talk about questions that are apolitical, ideas that are not related to politics, people all seem to be about the same. They all rely on inaccurate information at about their same rate. We're worried about everybody. We're not just worried about one group when it comes to this information. Even more interesting, if you were to look at how often someone, when we ask them what's the capital of Russia, how willing they are to look up the answer. So we have versions of the experiment where people are going to write what the answer to the capital of Russia is, but they're allowed to look it up online while they do the task. We don't see any difference in whether supporters of Trump or supporters of Hillary Clinton were willing to look up information. Everyone is similarly willing to look up information, or rather unwilling, meaning they only look it up about 20% of the time. People are not really motivated to look up the answers to inaccuracies, at least in our experiments. They're probably going to be much more motivated. It's something they care a lot about. And our experiment really is designed to look at apolitical information. So not necessarily politically loaded information, but ideas that are related to just facts in the world. Now, some of this relates to another idea I want to present to you called social contagion. So social contagion is the idea, many of you probably get together with friends, maybe virtually now over Zoom, and definitely before we all quarantined, people were getting together. And maybe even now you're getting together with family and friends. And when you get together with your friends and family, you talk about a lot of ideas, right? You reminisce together, you talk about what you did this week, you talk about what you're going to do next week, what you had for dinner, what you hope is going to happen at the election, what is going on with COVID, your concerns. And what we find in the lab is when you talk with your friends in groups that you really care about, sometimes people say things that are wrong, right? Not everyone can be correct all the time. Sometimes people say inaccuracies. Social contagion is the idea that sometimes when someone in a group says an inaccuracy, other people in the group take that up and use it later. So they're contaminated by the inaccuracies that their friends might say. And it gets even worse because sometimes people will believe that's not just an inaccuracy I believe now, but I came up with it, not the other people in the group. So let me repeat that just so you understand. Social contagion is the idea that people will take up the information that friends and collaborators say, whether it's true or not, and they might use that information later. And they don't just use that information, but they forget that the information was provided by their collaborators. They actually may think that they came up with the information. And that's a problem. If you're talking with friends about, let's say, immigration, and someone in that group gives you an incorrect statistic, maybe you'll take up that statistic and use it later in your arguments. And that could be a problem if it's not true. And it would be even worse if you believed you knew that statistic, not that that statistic came from someone else. In our experiments, again, this looks more complicated. I promise it's not complicated. I'll walk you through it. What we're going to look at here is on this vertical axis, the proportion of time that someone uses an incorrect idea that their partner says. Okay? What we manipulate in this experiment is whether someone's partner was perceived to be a very credible source, a source that didn't really know what they were talking about, or we didn't give them any information about that source. And here's what you see. People are very likely, almost half the time, actually it is half the time, they use the inaccurate information that their partner said to complete later tasks, to make decisions. If they think their partner knows what they're talking about, if they are a credible source, they use that information, which is a problem when the information is wrong. But if they believe their partner doesn't really know what they're talking about, they're much less likely to use that information. So knowing something about the credibility of another source influences the likelihood we're going to use their information later. The most interesting thing, I think, to me, maybe not to you, but to me in this experiment, is that if you don't know anything about the credibility of your partner, it seems like you treat them like they're credible. So people, it seems like their default belief is, I'm going to believe someone else, unless I get evidence that says I shouldn't. So again, this can be good if what our partners say is correct, but is a problem when what our partners say is really wrong. Hopefully that's clear to everyone. So what I've shown you, and this is just a handful of experiments, I haven't given you all the details, and we test lots of different kinds of information, that people tend to show a tendency towards reproducing inaccurate information that they read, hear, and see, that people are much less evaluative than we might hope they would be. And they're convinced by and use information that's patently wrong, that they should know beforehand is wrong when it's presented by someone else. And actually, at this point, I can tell you all the ways in which inaccuracies can be problematic. In fact, what we can do here is start to talk about some prescriptions for fighting exposures to inaccuracies, which I would hope would be applicable to thinking about fake news. Not just, what's the capital of Russia, which is an interesting fact, but actually knowing something about when someone makes an argument about global warming, whether it's real or not, or someone makes an argument about whether we should be wearing masks, or whether there will be COVID inoculations available over the next few months, or whether you should get a flu shot. When those arguments are presented, what can we do to make sure we're thinking most critically about those ideas so we can make valid judgments? So one thing we see is that people tend to rely on inaccurate information when the texts they're reading don't require them to evaluate. When I'm reading a text that doesn't motivate me to care about the contents, or I'm not in the mood to evaluate, sometimes we're tired and we're reading or we're watching the news. If the news organization doesn't encourage me to interrogate the ideas, to evaluate the information, I'm not going to evaluate as much. And that can be a problem, because that could mean I could use the inaccuracies that get presented. Additionally, and this starts to connect to the idea of political information, people tend to rely more on inaccuracies when those inaccuracies are tied up in things they already believe or care about. So for example, if I'm of a particular political allegiance and an inaccuracy gets presented that aligns with what I believe, I'm more likely to believe it than if inaccuracy comes that is in contrast to what I should believe or want to believe. My identity, what I think is important, what I value, is going to influence how likely I'm going to evaluate something that's presented to me. You can see how that relates to politics, right? So if you have strong political beliefs, Republican, Democrat, Green Party, neutral, whatever it is, if an idea is presented that runs counter to what you believe, you're going to be less likely to think about it or evaluate it. When something aligns with what you already believe, you are probably more likely to endorse it. So that's a problem. We really want to evaluate things that we're hearing. So when what we're presented with connects with who we think we are already, we're less likely to evaluate. When misinformation is plausible, we're more likely to be fooled and convinced. So remember the earlier example I gave you about what the capital of Russia is? And I showed you that if we present people with St. Petersburg, 30% of the participants we ask will say St. Petersburg later. If I change that to Tokyo is the capital of Russia, nobody gets it wrong. And the reason they don't get it wrong is because Tokyo is not a plausible example of what the capital of Russia would be. St. Petersburg is actually a plausible example, right? St. Petersburg is in the right geographical location. People there are of Russian, historical descent. They speak Russian. So that's a plausible idea. We see similar things. If I told someone that the capital of Illinois is Chicago, I can fool people because Chicago is a plausible capital. It's the biggest city. It has much of the political action. It's often the center of news in Illinois. It's a plausible false idea. If I said the capital of Illinois is New York City, you're not going to get it wrong because it's not a plausible idea. So when misinformation is plausible, when parts of it make sense, you're more likely to believe it. In fact, this is what QAnon and other organizations really rely on. They'll make some elements of what they talk about important and plausible. For example, child trafficking is really not something we want to see happen. We want to fight against it. So that's something we care about. And they'll quote some statistics talking about child trafficking. So they make it plausible. But then within that, they might embed other ideas that are less plausible. So if I start to be convinced, that can steamroll. Okay. If misinformation is repeated, we're more likely to use it later. Again, this is advertisers love this idea. They're going to repeat ideas to you over and over again. So it's easily remembered and you're more likely to repeat it yourself, accidentally or intentionally, and you're more likely to believe it. Again, advertisers love this. Politicians love this. Politicians will say the same talking points over and over again till it's so well ingrained in memory, you remember it so much that you may come to believe it. We see when people are given information by sources they think are credible, they're more likely to rely on inaccurate information than if they get information from sources they think are less credible. And what we're starting to see in our lab is if you don't know anything about the credibility of the source, people often seem to rely on those sources too. You got to learn something about that source being wrong or problematic or not a good source. Now, there's a challenge here, right? Because people differ in who they think is a credible source. There are some people who believe that Biden is credible and some believe he's not credible. There are others who believe President Trump is credible and some who believe he's not credible. So that's going to influence different people differently. But we know when you find someone credible, you're more likely to endorse what they say. And here's an interesting thing people are starting to talk about. There are some individuals who prefer not to evaluate. And this, of course, can change depending on how much you care about information. So here I'll give away something. I'm a New York Yankees fan. If there's anything you want to know to convey to you that I'm a New Yorker, I'm a Yankees fan. So if someone tells me something about the Cubs that's wrong, I'm just not going to evaluate it. I don't care that much about it. But if someone tells me something about the Yankees, I'm going to evaluate very carefully because I care about that team. Under certain circumstances, I prefer to evaluate, and in other circumstances, I might not. There are some colleagues of mine in Canada who've done some work looking at how much people like to evaluate in general. So they have a very short test they give people to see how much do you like to evaluate. And what they find is the people who really like to evaluate are much less likely to fall victim to inaccurate information and are much less likely to endorse fake news headlines. But people who are less willing to evaluate, who don't like to reason carefully, are more likely to fall victim to fake news, more likely to endorse fake news headlines, and more likely to repeat and share misinformation. So there's a real challenge here is figuring out who likes to evaluate and who doesn't, and then what do you do about it, right? How do we help people become more interested in evaluating? I just have two more slides left, and then I can finish up this brief presentation. So one thing we're really interested in now in the lab is how does confidence matter with respect to people's falling victim to inaccurate information? So if I'm really confident that I know everything, I don't need to learn anything else. When I'm presented with inaccurate information that already aligns with what I believe I know a lot about, I might not evaluate it very carefully. We actually see in our lab that the people who are most overconfident about health ideas, so like ways in which you should take medicine, how often you should see the doctor, whether you should get a flu shot, even some COVID related things. The people who are the most confident, they'll report to you that I know everything about health issues, are often the people who have the most misunderstandings. The people who are the least confident have fewer misunderstandings. So there's something about overconfidence that makes people resistant to being careful and evaluative, and that's a problem. So we have to think about how do we help people become less confident. I've heard some friends and colleagues say that many politicians are very overconfident about what they say, and they need to be made less confident about what they say so they can really evaluate information. If we're overconfident, we're never going to question what we know, and that can be a problem. So we're starting to study that in our lab, this role of confidence and misinformation. The last thing I want to mention is, in this talk, I haven't presented any information that's politically laden. Remember, we're talking about facts and ideas like the capital of cities, historical events, but we're not talking about politically laden ideas like the right to choose or Supreme Court designations or, again, global warming, things that are politically laden right now. So an important question is what happens when people are presented with information that's wrong, that's politically laden? And at least what we're seeing, I didn't present anything today on it, but what we're seeing is if you, as part of your identity, count yourself as a Republican, you're much more likely to believe Republican ideas. Conversely, if you count yourself as a Democrat, you're more likely to believe Democratic ideas. So that can create problems. Both of those cases create problems for evaluating information. When someone presents to you statistics about immigration and policies about immigration, the way you're going to interact with that information is a function of what you already believe and what you consider core to your identity and belief system. So we have to ask, how do we help people become more evaluative so they don't just believe things they already believe, so they don't fall victim to inaccurate information? People are invested in and biased towards things they want to believe. So to make sure people don't fall victim to fake news, to make sure they really interrogate fake news ideas, they're going to have to interrogate who they are and what their belief systems are. One challenge we see a lot about, you've probably heard of these terms, echo chambers and filter bubbles. These are the ideas that people tend not to expose themselves to ideas that they don't already believe. For example, people who are staunchly Democrat tend not to go to Republican events, and Republicans tend not to go to Democratic events. So what that means is people are only being exposed to ideas they're already familiar with and they already agree with. And that means they believe those ideas more. They're never really exposing themselves to a diversity of ideas. There's some interesting work showing that people on Facebook, their friends tend to share their political views, right? They're not seeing other political views or other ideas. People who are staunchly anti-vaccine proponents interact mainly with other people who are anti-vaxxers. So this creates a problem for understanding ideas if you're only lending yourself attention to people with the same ideas. So we have to figure out, how do we help people get out of those echo chambers and filter bubbles? One thing we've been doing, I'm in both in psychology and in education, so I'm trying to think about how can we help students become more evaluative in school settings. And two things we need to do is teach them what is an argument and how does an argument get supported with evidence. So when someone watches the news and a claim is made, we want students and adults to really think about what was the claim and what evidence is needed to support that claim. So when a politician makes a claim, what evidence is needed? We just saw two sets of debates in the last few weeks and claims were made. We want viewers to say, what makes me believe that claim? What evidence is there for that? And additionally, we want people to become familiar with professional practices. When a politician says fake news is out there, we want people to know, what do journalists actually do? What do journalists do to prevent fake news? And what do good journalists do? And what do the problematic journalists do? What do good scientists do? And what do problematic scientists do? What are the practices these people engage in? And if we know something about that, we can be armed with the knowledge to figure out whether something is accurate or not. So when a newscaster says something, we want to know, what did that broadcaster do to make that claim? So that's what we're trying to train people to think about. And lastly, really think about whether there are individual differences in people's likelihood they want to evaluate information. In the data I showed you today, we don't see differences between Republicans and Democrats, but there are cases where there are some people who are more or less willing to evaluate. So those can create problems for being exposed to fake news. If I don't like to evaluate information, presenting me with fake news is going to be a real problem, especially if I'm active on social media and I share that information with other people. So what I've tried to do today is give you a little bit of an idea of some of the kinds of ways people fall victim to inaccurate information. That includes, but is not limited to, fake news. And being resistant to fake news and inaccurate information requires us to be vigilant, well-practiced, and resourced, right? We need access to the resources we can look up to double check information, to make sure claims are true or not. And it's really incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we do this, especially in a democracy that relies upon thinking about and understanding a diversity of opinions and views and evidence. So at this point, I'm going to stop. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm so happy to see so many people again, because I'm in my kitchen. My wife and I are staring at each other every day like, can we see anyone else? I'm in the kitchen, you're in the kitchen. I'm in the living room, you're in the living room. So it's really great to see people. And I want to thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you.
Thank you, David. That was so interesting. So I invite the congregation's questions, but please remember to reserve your comments and your extended questions until after the service is over, when you can join David in a chat room. Now, if you have a question, unmute yourself and raise your hand, and then I'll call on you, but then please mute yourself again after you've asked your question. And so, let's see how I can. Scott.
Yeah, I think I'm on unmute now. It's really two questions. One is, what does the First Amendment in the United States say about inaccurate information? I know you can't yell fire in a movie theater, but how does scientific progress move forward? Somebody's ultimately going to be wrong, but you're going to challenge those ideas. Who's the adjudicator? And then the other sort of related question perhaps is, if you have 100 facts that you report on in a newspaper, you can create a very different idea in a person's mind by, basically reporting on the 10 that sort of are failure confirmation bias. Even though they're all true, they're creating a very false impression in the person's mind. I just wondered what if you had any comment on that.
Scott, thanks for those questions. They're really great and interesting. And I want to tell everyone there's a cohort of individuals at Northwestern, not just at Northwestern, but that's where I work, so I'm going to mention it, that are studying precisely these issues. And they're people in political science
in the Medill School of Journalism, in education, in psychology, and in communication. So there really are people across fields and areas that are trying to tackle these questions. I'm not a scholar, a First Amendment scholar, so I really can't speak to what the ways in which the First Amendment might come into play. But I will say determining different sources and evaluating information from different news sources and different outlets is one of the best ways that research suggests to determine what is true and to deal with opinion. So what you're describing, where a newspaper might opt to highlight particular facts and ideas over others and could potentially bias people, that's certainly a challenge and is likely to happen in circumstances where we only expose ourselves to a subset of information sources. So often you'll hear about news organizations like to make this generalization that people either watch Fox News or CNN, right? They're either reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And there might be some truth to that, but I think in an information-rich society like today, it's crucial that we all try to read and listen and view lots of different sources, even if we don't think they're good sources, because we want to get a sense of what's the larger space within which ideas are being presented. And maybe from there, we can cull together things that we see repeated across multiple sources, are the kinds of ideas we might see, well, those are the ones that perhaps are worth thinking about and true. So with respect to the second part of your question, I think it's really contingent upon us as information seekers to seek out and speak to lots of different people and to talk to lots of different sources. I have a colleague at Medill, Rachel Mercy. She just left to go to UT Austin, and I'm still so sad she left Northwestern. And she studies news consumption. And her argument was always, it's really crucial, even if you're not a fan of CNN, you should be watching CNN. Even if you're not a fan of Fox News, you should watch a little bit of Fox News, right? Watch these sources to see what kinds of information are being presented so that you can get an understanding of the larger information space and not be biased by the positioning or highlighting of particular ideas. Certainly there are some sources you shouldn't look at all. And you can look online. There are some news sources that are just completely, Denver Guardian is a news source that's just not a real news source that should not be consulted in any way. But other sources have mixtures of viewpoints, and you'll want to look at those. Again, with respect to the first part about who adjudicates what's true or not, that's particularly tricky. I think what you're speaking to relates to the concerns people currently have about the Supreme Court nominations and how those are going to play out, because those are individuals who we all think of as the adjudicators, and the concerns about stacking and the concerns about whether there's going to be fairness and equality in the viewpoints and in the gender representation and in race and ethnicity representation, I think get at some of the issues you're voicing. So Scott, those are really important. I appreciate hearing those. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Oh, Doug.
So I have, when I read the news, I often am reading them from one of those aggregators on my iPad, and it'll show me liberal stuff or conservative stuff. And often I'm liberal. I prefer to read the liberal things, and some of the headlines are very provocative. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Then I read the article and I'm like, there's nothing here. There's absolutely nothing that actually, whatever they're saying is just way overboard. And yet I don't necessarily want to read all those articles. And is that a tactic they often are doing, that they're trying to influence you by showing you the tidbit, but then they're covering their butt by having the facts underneath it that don't go anywhere?
Douglas, thank you. And by the way, I liked your screenshot, the Far Side picture that you had on before. That was great. I was laughing when you came on. Yeah, that's a really great question. So what Douglas is talking about here is clickbait kinds of headlines, right? Where you'll see a headline that sounds very provocative, or it sounds very informative, and then you click the headline and actually there's not much to it. And you see these headlines on aggregators. You see, regardless of which news source you like, they're doing it. CNN does it and Fox News does it. New York Times website does it. The New Yorker does it. Wall Street Journal does it. Breitbart does it. Snopes does it. So what they're doing there is, remember, the goal of many of these outlets is to get readers, right? They want advertising dollars and they want people to read the sources. So the challenge here is, how do you as a viewer come to reckon with the notion that the headline might be very provocative and interesting, but actually there's not much there underneath it, right? There's not much detail there. And this is a real challenge. There are some news organizations and some third-party systems that are trying to argue for labeling headlines, so giving you like a little Q next to the headline. So they want to find some third-party group that evaluates all the news you're going to get and gives you a little cue as to whether that news is reliable or it's nonsense or it's detailed enough. And the big argument now is, who are those third-party people going to be, right? So how are you going to find third-party people that are actually neutral? There's an organization that you might want to look up. I'm not sure whether you should follow them yet, but you might want to look up, called NewsGuard. And NewsGuard, I think they require you to pay. So I'm not sure if it's worth your time. But I've heard that they're trying to do things like they put a little marker next to news. If it's green, means it was well supported by evidence, and the journalists actually indicated exactly how they did it, and the headline lined up with the content. If there's a yellow sign, it means like slow down. If there's a red one, don't you read it? So it's a real challenge. I think what we need to do is think about, news sources aren't just presenting news out of the goodness out of their heart, right? They're presenting information because their goal is to generate revenue, right? So they're going to give you a really exciting headline in the hopes you're going to click on it. When our Facebook friends and our friends on Twitter put an exciting thing up there, it gets us to click it. It's the same principle. So determining, how do we deal with something that looks exciting and not fall victim to it, not believe it, is a real challenge. So Douglas, what you're describing is something that there have been a couple discussions in government sectors talking about how can they sort of monitor this. But again, it gets at, I think, what Scott is talking about, some freedom of speech, right? Some issues. So how do you ensure that happens? Aggregators love to create clickbaity headlines. They want you to use their news sources.